The quiet intimacy of Deacon's apartment carried a warmth so convincing it felt almost protective, as though the walls themselves had agreed to shelter the fragile illusion growing inside that space, an illusion built not on recklessness, but on a careful, almost desperate belief that life could still offer something gentle after years defined by chaos, regret, and consequences that never seemed to fully fade, and in that soft, amber light, Deacon allowed himself to believe again, to trust again, to imagine a future that did not feel like a negotiation with the past but a departure from it, a clean line drawn between what had been and what might still be possible. Across from him, the woman he believed to be Taylor carried herself with a calm sincerity that seemed to validate everything he wanted to feel, her voice measured, her gaze steady, her presence grounding in a way that disarmed his lingering doubts, because if there had been moments of hesitation, fragments of uncertainty he could not fully articulate, they dissolved in the quiet rhythm of their conversations, in the way she spoke about healing, about second chances, about building something real from the wreckage of lives that had been fractured too many times to count. When she suggested taking a step forward, not just in words but in commitment, in a future that extended beyond the immediate comfort of shared space into something more permanent, something more defined, Deacon did not hesitate, his reaction instinctive, almost relieved. As though he had been waiting for permission to fully surrender to the hope he had been holding back, and in that moment, his trust was not cautious but complete, his belief in her not questioned but embraced. Because to question it would have meant confronting the possibility that this fragile piece might not be real, and that was a possibility he was not prepared to face. The conversation moved forward with a kind of quiet certainty, each word reinforcing the narrative they were constructing together, a narrative of redemption, of healing, of love that had endured enough to finally find stability. And it was precisely this sense of stability that made what came next so devastating, because it was not just the revelation of a lie, it was the destruction of a reality that had been carefully, deliberately built. The shift came without warning, without any gradual unraveling, but with a suddenness that shattered the illusion in an instant, the door opening not as an interruption but as an intrusion, a force entering the space with a presence that could not be mistaken, could not be ignored. And when Sheila stepped into the room, her face no longer concealed, her identity no longer hidden, the air itself seemed to freeze, the warmth replaced by something sharp, something cold, something that carried with it the unmistakable weight of danger. For a moment, Deacon did not move, did not speak, because what he saw did not align with what he believed, the image before him conflicting so completely with the reality he had been living that his mind struggled to reconcile the two, and in that moment of hesitation, Sheila's voice filled the silence, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a chilling satisfaction, a tone that suggested not only control but enjoyment, as though she had been waiting for this moment, anticipating it, savoring it. Her revelation unfolded with a precision that made it all the more horrifying, each detail delivered with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, as she explained how she had watched, how she had studied, how she had positioned herself to step into Taylor's life not as an imitation but as a replacement, her transformation made possible through a surgical alteration so exact it erased the boundaries between identity and performance, allowing her to inhabit a role that extended beyond appearance into behavior, into voice, into presence, and as she spoke, the depth of her manipulation became impossible to ignore, because this was not a momentary deception, it was a sustained invasion, a calculated takeover that had allowed her to move through their lives undetected, to influence, to disrupt, to reshape the dynamics of a family that had already endured more than its share of turmoil. Deacon's reaction came not as a single burst of emotion but as a series of fractures, disbelief giving way to horror, horror to anger, and beneath it all, a profound sense of violation that extended beyond himself. Because the realization that he had been deceived was not limited to his own experience, it encompassed everything that had been built around that deception, every interaction, every decision, every moment that had now been revealed as part of a larger, more sinister design. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a desperation that he could not fully control, demanding explanation, demanding truth, even as the truth was already being laid out before him in a way that left no room for denial, and it was in that moment that Sheila revealed the final piece of her plan. The detail that transformed the situation from a psychological manipulation into something far more immediate, far more dangerous. The hidden room beneath the apartment, a space that had existed unnoticed, unseen, became the center of that revelation, and when the truth of Taylor's condition was exposed, when it became clear that she was not absent by choice but by force, restrained, silenced. Hidden away as Sheila moved freely in her place, the horror of the situation reached a level that transcended personal betrayal, becoming something far more urgent, far more terrifying, because it meant that this was not just about deception, it was about control, about captivity, about a life held in suspension while another was lived in its place. The image of Taylor, bound and unable to speak, her presence reduced to a secret hidden beneath the surface of a life that continued without her, struck Deacon with a force that left him shaken to his core, and his response, immediate and unfiltered, was driven not by thought but by instinct. A need to act, to undo what had been done, to restore what had been taken. His descent into the hidden space was marked by a desperation that bordered on panic, each step carrying the weight of urgency, of fear, of the possibility that he might already be too late, and when he reached her, when he saw her in that state, the reality of what had been happening beneath his own roof became almost unbearable because it forced him to confront not only Sheila's actions but his own unknowing complicity in them, the way his trust had been used to sustain a situation that now demanded immediate correction, immediate action. And as he moved to free her, his hands unsteady, his breath uneven, the urgency of the moment left no space for hesitation, only for the singular focus on getting her out, on restoring her voice, her presence, her place in a world that had continued without her. Above them, the situation continued to escalate, the ripple effects of Sheila's revelation spreading outward with a speed that reflected both the severity of the threat and the interconnected nature of the lives she had infiltrated, reaching Steffi with a force that shattered whatever sense of stability she had been holding on to, because the knowledge that her mother had been replaced, that she had been interacting not with Taylor but with Sheila, recontextualized every recent moment, every conversation, every decision, transforming them into something far more dangerous, far more uncertain. Her fear was not abstract, it was immediate, focused on her children, on the possibility that Sheila's reach extended further than they had realized, that the danger was not contained but active, ongoing, and her reaction, driven by both anger and terror, reflected a determination to act, to protect, to confront, even as the situation remained volatile and unpredictable. Ridge and Brooke, when they received the news, experienced a return of a fear they had hoped was behind them, a fear tied not just to Sheila as an individual, but to what she represented, the unpredictability, the capacity for manipulation, the willingness to cross boundaries that others would not even consider, and in that moment, the past did not feel distant. It felt immediate, as though everything they had endured before was happening again, only now with new layers, new stakes, new vulnerabilities that made the situation even more complex. Their response, though measured, carried an urgency that reflected their understanding of what was at risk, not just in terms of personal safety, but in terms of the stability of everything they had fought to maintain. The involvement of the Los Angeles police marked a transition from private crisis to public emergency, the search for Sheila expanding beyond the confines of personal relationships into a citywide effort that reflected both the seriousness of the threat and the difficulty of containing it. Because Sheila, as always, operated on a level that made her movements difficult to predict, her presence difficult to trace, and her disappearance, when it came, was not a retreat but a continuation, a shift into a new phase of a plan that had already demonstrated its capacity for disruption. The message she left behind, simple in its wording but profound in its implication, carried a chilling clarity, a declaration that what had just occurred was not an end but a beginning, that the game she had set in motion was still unfolding, still evolving, and that those involved were not merely reacting to it, but were already part of it in ways they could not fully see. As the city moved into a state of heightened awareness, as fear spread through the spaces Sheila had once infiltrated, the question of Taylor's survival remained unanswered, suspended between hope and uncertainty. A question that carried with it not only concern for her life, but a deeper recognition of how fragile their sense of control had been all along, how easily it could be disrupted, how quickly it could be taken away, and in that uncertainty lay the true weight of what had happened. Not just the exposure of a deception, but the opening of a conflict that would not resolve itself easily, a conflict that would demand vigilance, resilience, and a willingness to confront a threat that had already proven itself capable of moving unseen, of becoming something else, of turning the familiar into something unrecognizable. And as Deacon stood at the threshold between what had been and what now lay ahead, the reality settled in with a quiet, unrelenting force that the life he had believed in, the love he had trusted, had not only been an illusion, but had been used as a weapon in a game that was far from over, a game that had only just begun to reveal its true scope. The house did not return to silence after Taylor was freed. Instead, it seemed to hold onto the echo of everything that had happened within its walls, as though the truth had seeped into the structure itself, embedding a tension that refused to dissipate. And even as Deacon helped Taylor sit upright, even as he removed the restraints and tried to steady her trembling hands, there was an unspoken awareness that what they had just uncovered was only one layer of something far more complex. Something that extended beyond the immediate horror of her captivity into a wider network of intent, planning, and obsession that Sheila had been cultivating long before she ever stepped into his apartment disguised as someone else. Taylor's condition, fragile but conscious, carried its own urgency, her breath uneven, her eyes struggling to adjust not only to the light but to the reality of where she was and what had been done to her, and in that moment, her presence was both a relief and a warning. Because her survival confirmed that Sheila had not sought to eliminate her, but to replace her, to occupy her life in a way that was far more insidious, far more personal, and that distinction alone suggested that whatever came next would not follow the logic of simple violence, but something far more calculated, far more psychological. Deacon's guilt settled in quickly, deeply, not as a fleeting emotion but as a persistent weight that attached itself to every movement he made, every word he spoke, because the realization that all of this had unfolded within his own home, under his own watch, without his awareness, forced him into a confrontation with himself that he could not avoid, and though he tried to focus on Taylor, on her safety, on the immediate steps that needed to be taken, the thought lingered, unrelenting, that his trust, his need to believe, had been exploited in a way that had allowed Sheila to operate unchecked, and that knowledge would not easily release him. Yet there was no time to remain in that space of reflection, because above them, the world was already responding, already shifting into motion in a way that demanded action rather than contemplation. When Steffi arrived, the emotional impact of seeing her mother alive but visibly shaken broke through whatever composure she had been holding on to, her fear transforming into something sharper, more focused, a protective instinct that manifested as urgency, as anger, as a refusal to allow the situation to remain unresolved, and her presence changed the dynamic immediately, because where Deacon had been driven by guilt and confusion, Steffi was driven by clarity, by the need to act, to secure, to confront, and her first instinct was not to question but to assess, to determine what had been done, what remained unknown, and what needed to be addressed before Sheila could strike again. Taylor, though weakened, responded to her daughter's presence with a quiet strength, her voice strained but steady enough to convey what she remembered, fragments of time, of isolation, of moments where she had been aware that something was unfolding above her, something she could not stop. And those fragments, though incomplete, added a new dimension to the situation, suggesting that Sheila's plan had not been static, but evolving, adapting, shifting in response to opportunities that arose. Ridge and Brooke's arrival brought with it a shift from personal crisis to collective response, their presence carrying the weight of history, of experience, of previous encounters with Sheila that had taught them not to underestimate her. not to assume that her actions could be predicted or contained through conventional means, and as they took in the scene, as they saw Taylor, as they processed the implications of what had been revealed, their fear did not manifest as panic, but as a kind of controlled urgency. A recognition that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern, a continuation of something that had never truly ended, only paused, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. The involvement of law enforcement, though necessary, did little to ease that fear, because while the search for Sheila expanded, while resources were mobilized and the city itself became part of the effort to locate her, there was an underlying understanding among those who knew her best that she did not operate within the boundaries that such efforts could easily address, that her movements were guided by a logic that was deeply personal, deeply rooted in her own perception of relationships, of family, of belonging. As the hours passed, the investigation began to reveal small, unsettling details that pointed to the extent of her preparation, the careful way in which she had constructed her disguise, her access to medical procedures that allowed her to replicate Taylor's appearance with disturbing accuracy, the network of contacts she had used to move undetected, and each detail added to a growing picture of someone who had not acted impulsively but with intention, with patience, with a level of commitment that suggested this was not a single act of deception, but part of a larger vision she had been developing over time. And yet, despite these discoveries, despite the increasing clarity of how she had operated, her current whereabouts remained unknown, her absence itself becoming a presence, a shadow that lingered over every decision, every conversation, every moment of apparent calm. The message she left behind, simple in its wording but profound in its implication, began to take on greater significance as the reality of her disappearance settled in, because it suggested that what had happened was not the culmination of her plan, but its beginning. That the exposure of her actions, the rescue of Taylor, the mobilization of the police, were all variables she had anticipated, perhaps even intended, and that the next phase would unfold not in reaction to these events, but in alignment with a strategy that had yet to fully reveal itself. This realization shifted the focus from what had been done to what might still happen, from the past to the future, and in that shift lay a new kind of fear, one that was not tied to a specific event, but to the unpredictability of what might come next. Taylor's recovery became both a priority and a symbol, her presence a reminder of what had been taken and what had been restored, and as she began to regain her strength, her voice, her ability to fully engage with those around her, she also became a key to understanding what Sheila had intended, what she had observed, what she had sought to achieve through her actions, and in that role, Taylor found herself not only as a victim but as a witness, someone whose experience could help illuminate the path forward, even as she grappled with the emotional aftermath of what she had endured. Her reflections, though still forming, pointed to something that unsettled everyone who heard them, the sense that Sheila had not simply wanted to be her, but to replace her in a way that extended beyond appearance, into relationships, into influence, into the very fabric of the life she had built. And that ambition, that desire to occupy rather than destroy, suggested a level of fixation that made the situation far more dangerous than they had initially understood. Deacon, watching all of this unfold, found himself caught between the need to make amends and the realization that some things could not be undone, that his role in what had happened, however unintentional, would remain a part of the story, a part of how others saw him, a part of how he saw himself. And yet within that recognition lay a determination to act differently moving forward, to not allow the same vulnerabilities to be exploited again, to become not a passive participant but an active protector of those around him, even as he struggled with the knowledge that protection, in this case, might require confronting a threat that had already proven itself capable of bypassing every safeguard they had relied on. As night fell over the city, the sense of unease did not diminish, it deepened, settling into the spaces between moments, into the pauses between conversations, into the quiet that followed each update from the police. Each new piece of information that brought them closer to understanding what had happened, but no closer to knowing where Sheila was or what she would do next. The question of Taylor's survival had been answered, but it had been replaced by a far more complex and unsettling question, one that lingered at the edge of every thought. If this was only the beginning, then what? Exactly. Was Sheila planning?
Oh,